afternoon, everyone. My name is Anka Hotsama, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar. Today, we are talking about safe spaces, gender-based violence, human rights, and shelters. On behalf of NACOSA, thank you for making the time to join us today. Gender-based violence continues to affect millions of women, children, and vulnerable people across South Africa. While we often speak about gender-based violence in terms of statistics or criminal justice, today's discussion asks us to think more broadly. So, what does safety actually look like for a survivor? Is safety simply escaping the violence? Or does it also mean having access to shelter, healthcare, psychosocial support, justice, dignity, and the opportunity to rebuild a life? Today's webinar brings together experts working across these different areas to help us better understand what survivor-centered support looks like, or what it should look like in practice. Our objectives today are to explore the intersection between gender-based violence, human rights, and shelter services, to promote survivor-centered approaches to care and support, to learn from organizations working directly with survivors, and to strengthen collaboration between civil society, government, and other stakeholders to improve access to quality services. So just a few housekeeping points before we begin. You're welcome to post your comments and questions in the chat throughout the session, and we'll have a dedicated facilitated discussion and audience Q&A towards the end of today's program. Please also introduce yourselves in the chat, what organization you're from and where you're joining from. So without further ado, let's begin. Every important discussion needs context. Before we explore shelters, human rights, and survivor support, it's important that we first understand the broader context of gender-based violence in South Africa and why strengthening community systems remains so important. It is therefore my absolute pleasure to welcome Colleen Wagner, NACOSA's Catalytic Grant Manager, who will provide the context setting for today's discussion. Colleen, over to you.
So, good morning, good afternoon, sorry. Thank you, Anka. Good afternoon, colleagues. I am so excited to be here, and I'm excited for this topic, a very, very critical topic in our time and our season. I am going to, I think the slides will be shown right now, and then we will just cover this. Thank you. So, as Anka mentioned, I'm going to just set the context for our conversation and really the critical need for breaking the cycle of GBV in South Africa. Next slide, please. So, the critical part of what we're wanting to do or where we are at is around strengthening community systems to address GBV. And when I look at the chat and I look at all the partners that have joined, I see so many people from community-based organizations or shelters and people that are really relevant to this space that we are discussing today. So again, thank you, colleagues, for taking the time to join. NACOSA's work is grounded in the belief that everyone deserves access to quality, survivor-centered services, regardless of where they live or their circumstances. So with that, our approach is preventing violence before it occurs through community mobilization, youth programs, and addressing harmful social and gender norms. Also around ensuring survivors have access to quality post-violence care and support services, which many of you offer. And then also around strengthening referral pathways so that the survivors can access health, psychosocial and social development protection and justice services. And then lastly, using this data, this M&E data that's produced and evidence to improve service delivery and inform decision making. So we're not just thinking abstractly, we're using the data that is garnered or generated and then making informed decisions based on the data. Next slide, please. So some of our key achievements, just to again around the context, some of our key achievements. So before the funding cuts, the USAID funding cuts in 2025, NACOSA had a national GBV program which served 32,000 survivors a year in 100 facilities. We reached more than 100,000 girls and young women each year with prevention services. We also helped decentralize post-violence care, making services more accessible, particularly in our rural and in our underserved communities where we don't have a Tutuzela care center. We've supported capacity building for clinicians, for community workers, for organizations, and local stakeholders while developing tools, systems. I spoke earlier about the M&E system, systems and data platforms that strengthen the overall GBV responses. So if you see on the right, we've just put some data. My colleague Sophie has put some data onto the slide around the achievements from that piece of work. Also around human rights, we ensure that survivors can exercise their rights to safety, dignity, health, protection, and justice. By implementing strong systems and accessible services are critical to translating those rights into meaningful support for survivors. Next slide, please. And so how do we do this? We wanting to echo repeatedly in this webinar that partnerships matter. No single organization, and this is why you are all here as well, no single organization can address GBV alone. Effective responses requires collaboration across government, across civil society, healthcare, shelters, justice services, and communities alike. Partnerships ensure coordinated, survivor centered support and strong referral pathways. So, our partnership approach at NACOSA is then working with community organizations, government departments, health facilities, and shelters, strengthening local community systems, services, qualities, and accountability, and then expanding access to care for vulnerable populations, particularly in underserved communities. And we understand and we believe in it takes a village to end GBV. Next slide, my last slide. So, um, just want to frame it again around the NSP, all the work that we do. And obviously, this will be in the GBV context, it's linked to the NSP for GBVF, pillars 2, 4, and 6. So, 2 being prevention and rebuilding of social cohesion, and then 4, response care and support and healing, and then 6, research and information management. So, thank you. It's been my privilege just to share the context of where we are and what we aim to do through this webinar. I'll hand back to Anke. Thank you, Anke.
Thank you very much, Colleen. I think you've reminded us that responding to gender-based violence is also about strengthening the systems, the partnerships, and also the community so that survivors are able to access the support that they need. And that provides a perfect foundation for our next speaker. Our next speaker is Sharon Kouta, a respected social worker and gender activist with more than 40 years of experience in the gender-based violence sector. Sharon has worked across government, across the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, and also NACOSA, where she led the organization's gender-based violence program. So throughout Sharon's career, she has played an important role in strengthening victim empowerment services and advancing support for survivors of gender-based violence across South Africa. Although officially retired, Sharon certainly has not slowed down. She continues to serve through a number of volunteer initiatives, including Reach for Recovery and Look Good, Feel Better, apologies, supporting cancer patients and advocating for their emotional well-being. Today, Sharon will be sharing her insights on the state of GBV and the importance of shelter services in South Africa. So please join me in welcoming Sharon Kouta. Over to you, Sharon.
Thank you very much. And thank you for getting me, out of retirement to come and present to you. It's really a great pleasure. So if you load my slide, you've got my slides, and if you can show it, and then I'll go through it. Thank you very much. So I will be presenting as a board member of the National Shelter Movement. So I'm representing the National Shelter Movement of South Africa on this webinar. Thank you. The next slide. So who are we? In terms of shelter, in terms of the national shelter movement, we are, there to establish and supporting provincial forums. Then in terms of advocacy, we're the voice for victims and survivors, trying to interrupt the cycle of violence. We've got a research component, and there we're doing GBV and sheltering. Partnership is very important for us. So government departments, civil society, and donors. Networking is crucial, and it's multi-sectoral collaboration and shared experience. Then in terms of capacity building, there's a lot of stuff that the National Shelter Movement is doing, including webinars and training. And in terms of legal reform, we engage with government in legislation and lobbying for reform. And then in terms of our voice, you can find us on Facebook, on X, formerly Twitter, on Instagram, on YouTube, on LinkedIn website, and on the email. And then, as I said, we've got monthly webinars and an annual national Indaba. And very importantly, is that we've got a national 24-hour toll-free shelter helpline. It's flighted at the bottom of the slide, but I'll also flight it at the end of my presentation. The next slide. So the mission, vision, and mission is just, the vision is to be the united voice on sheltering for women and children affected by gender-based violence in South Africa. The mission is to network, advocate, and lobby provincial, national, and international stakeholders and engage in service provision, legislation, and the capacity building on GBV and sheltering of abused women and their children in South Africa. The next slide. So the services that we offer, we're providing safe accommodation, psychosocial support, legal support, and that is in terms of protection orders and maintenance orders, childcare. Women don't go to a shelter on their own. They go there with children. So that's included in the services that we provide. Also the healthcare needs of women and children. The children that goes to school. So, we try and make sure that that is not interrupted. And then in terms of economic empowerment, we make sure that when women are there, that they can be assisted in terms of the CV and the job readiness. The next slide. So the challenges faced by NSMSA. And that, we can't talk enough about the inadequate subsidization of shelters. I had a look at, the funding that shelters get from government, and it makes up something like 25% the operational cost of shelters. In many provinces, there's late disbursement of subsidies, but still, when the new funding cycle starts in April, we can't say to staff that, you'll get your salary in August if funding only comes through in August. So in some provinces, that is still a problem. The fundraising environment, we all know, is challenging. And Colin spoke about, the previous funding that we've had. And when that funding ended, it really, really put us in a really, really bad position. Housing for survivors of GBV, that's not the priority for government. And that this is the need that many of the survivors of GBV have. The lack of mental health and substance abuse programs in shelters. Many women, also face issues of substance abuse. And because of funding, we do not have enough funding to provide all the services that is needed. A lack of standardization of funding across provinces. Not all provinces pay the same for the shelters in their provinces. And then we find silos between government departments. The one doesn't talk to the other one. So that and still, as a shelter movement or as shelters, we must try and navigate, working with these different departments. And then there's a reduction in numbers of NGOs. In some provinces, the department is taking over the services themselves. So there's uncertainty for many shelters or many provinces. Thank you. The next slide. I looked at this, and this was, on our website, and this is the highlights for 2025. It's a lot of stuff, so you can't read all of it. I just want to say that in terms of leadership and advocacy, in terms of policy reform, we are promoting that and making sure, that our voice is heard. We have global representation, and that is, at the international shelter movement. Some of the colleagues attended that in Australia last week. In terms of supporting survivors, we have a 24/7 national GBV shelter helpline, and I can give you the stats, in terms of the helpline for 25-26. In total, 3,011 calls were received. 234 people were placed in shelters. In terms of safety plans and emergencies, 292. 143 protection orders were helped with, and other GBV issues were 853. So you can see that the shelter helpline is really doing quite a lot of work. Safety planning guide, we've got that also on our website. And then if you go onto the National Shelter Movement website, you will find a lot of survivor resources and stories that I think will be very useful for you. And then in terms of building sustainable support, we had a Back and Buddy fundraising campaign last year, because as you know, I've mentioned previously that funding is not adequate. So we need to do all kinds of different things just to raise funds. Thank you. Next slide. Again, still, some of the highlights, the 2025 highlights. During national months, like August, the Women's Month, Youth Month, and the 16 Days of Activism, we've got various campaigns. You can go onto the website just to see what people were saying. And, the one was, I walked out live. And this woman, the story that a survivor is telling, and she's saying, so can you. And this is what we're really hoping that survivors can do. And then, also withdrawal of cases, GBV cases. So survivors will go and report a case. But because, of the economic dependency often are on the perpetrator, they withdraw cases. When you look at the SAPS femicide, it's a huge number that is still happening in our country. So during these national campaigns, we've got different activities that is taking place. One activity that I'll just talk to you about it, and that is this CEO campaign. And that means, that we are trying to get CEOs to join, to go to a shelter, but obviously they'll speak to us about that. And they'll go through the whole process that the victim will go through when she enters the shelter. So she'll go in on the morning and then stay for the program, sleep there, and then, the next day will obviously also leave. But it's a process that we need to guide people through. You can't just say, I'd like to do it, because, obviously it's a very sensitive matter, but that is one of the campaigns that we've also had last year. So in terms of advocacy and systems reform, budget advocacy, withdrawal of cases, I spoke about that. And then also, what we spoke about was the Omotoso acquittal. We just couldn't believe that, this happened. And we made our voice heard in the media about that. So GBV, raising awareness, that's very important for us. Thank you. You can go to the next slide. Shelters play a fundamental role, that we say, in mitigating and responding to and addressing violence against women and their children. Shelters offer safe accommodation, they provide opportunities for healing and rebuilding, and they play a significant role in interrupting and breaking the cycle of violence. The next one. So this is our toll-free number that we want people to have. And just to say that it's a 24-hour number. You can also send an SMS, a WhatsApp, or a please call me, or you can send an email to the National Shelter Movement. The next one. Is that my last slide? Thank you. I thought there was a slide about challenges, but it's in order. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sharon. And thank you for that very important reflection. Apologies, let me turn my video on. There we go. Thank you, Sharon. So I think what really stood out to me was also the reflection on funding and the impact that the funding cuts has also had on shelters and GBV services within South Africa. And I'm sure we'll unpack this within our facilitated discussion, and it's also probably going to come out within the Q&A from participants that have joined. But also one of the important messages from your presentation that stood out is that shelters are more than just a place of temporary accommodation. We're not just looking at housing. We're also looking at protection. We're looking at psychosocial support. We're looking at navigating a legal system and also just helping survivors begin rebuilding their lives. And that naturally brings us to our next discussion and also our next speaker. So if shelters provide safety, then human rights help define what survivors should experience when they are seeking support. Our next speaker will help us explore what it truly means to deliver survivor-centered services through a human rights lens. Vuyokazi Yokwe is an attorney with expertise in constitutional law, human rights, and public interest litigation. She holds an LLB from the University of Fort Hare and also an LLM from the University of the Western Cape. Vuyokazi has worked across the public interest and legal services sectors, including Legal Aid South Africa, the Center for Applied Legal Studies, and the African Policing Civilian Oversight Forum, where she advanced strategic litigation, legal research, and advocacy to promote constitutional rights, police accountability, and systemic legal reform. Her work has included contributing to decriminalization advocacy, the development of global principles, and leading advocacy initiatives across a range of human rights portfolios. As a legal officer at NACOSA, Vuyokazi provides legal support under the My Journey program. She also represents NACOSA on the NGBVF collective, contributing to efforts to strengthen responses to gender-based violence and femicide through policy, advocacy, and multi-sectoral collaboration. Today, Vuyokazi will be presenting on advancing human rights through survivor-centered GBV services. Vuyokazi, over to you.
Thank you, Anke, for that introduction, as well as the previous speaker that spoke at length. But I just want to connect a few things. That one of the things that stood up is breaking the cycle of violence. But the critical question is, how do we do that? Through advancing human rights and focusing on survivor-centered GBV services. Please move to the next slide. So advancing human rights is that one of the things is that human rights are not an abstract context that only exists in legal legislative frameworks or constitutions, but they ought to be transferred to or realized to become a lived reality for in this context, survivors of GBV. And what must change so everyone every survivor can exercise their rights safely. And that's one of the critical questions that we get to explore in the context of GBV. So what should change is that we should strive to move from legal foundation through survivor-centered principles to a system that make protection and justice a reality. And that is done through the law, policy, practice, and experience. Please move to the next slide. And why GBV is a human rights issue. One of the focus is looking at GBV as a purely criminal justice system, but we cannot be breaking the cycle of violence if we do not look at GBV and responses from a holistic, interconnected dimension. And that dimension requires us to connect the law, which speaks to the rights and duties. GBV, gender-based violence, violates rights that are enshrined in our constitution, and those rights are your right to dignity, equality, safety and protection, and safety, protection, and autonomy. And gender-based violence should always be understood as a human rights violation and not just a criminal offense that get to be confined to the processes of the criminal justice system alone. So, and it's important to know that rights only become real when the law, policy, and practice are aligned. And one of the critical questions that we ought to ask ourselves is that what must states and institutions do to prevent harm? And one of the movements that we've seen across the country that seeks to transformatively integrate the law to practices and also curb and prevent gender-based violence as a human rights issue is that we've seen quite a lot of institutional policy commitments, including the declaration of gender-based violence as a national disaster, which was a very positive move for the country. And in terms of policy framework, in terms of how we respond as a sector, as a government and as a state to gender-based violence. This is to ensure that we realized and we ensure that the human rights of survivors of gender-based violence are transferred to or realized to be a lived reality. And a practice, it's really what survivors should experience on the ground, because the policies and the law become a symbolic move if those do not translate into lived realities of the people on the ground. And this is how we translate the practices, the policies and the law to actually make sense, to provide protection, to break the cycle of violence, and to be understood and realized by the people on the ground. Please move on to the next slide. And our legal foundation is that we have a supreme constitution in South Africa. It is a four-layered obligation that shapes South Africa's response to gender-based violence, and we have the constitution that takes the supremacy and every implementation practice or a response to gender-based violence should actually be in alignment to the Constitution. But South Africa does not only end with having a very solid constitution in terms of ensuring people's rights are realized. We have international and regional frameworks, including CEDAW's, CRC, and one transformative one, the Maputo Protocol. And in country, we also domestically have your Domestic Violence, Sexual Offences Act and Children's Act that also speak to gender-based violence and ensure that we have a solid legislative foundation for a human rights-centered and survivor-centered response to gender-based violence. And in terms of policy, we have seen the NSP that our first speaker spoke to and then the interventions. And we also have our Chapter 9 institutions. And if I understand correctly, that they've partnered, our Chapter 9 institutions have partnered to actually seek to to have an inquiry that seeks to reform the criminal justice system in terms of how the system itself responds to gender-based violence, and we have a parliamentary oversight that consistently hears reports on how the country is doing in terms of gender-based violence responses, not just the statistics, but how we consistently translate the law into lived realities. We can move to the next slide, please. And what does then survivor-centered principles look like? Survivor-centered principles are the connection between human rights obligation and everyday GBV practice. And while the human rights law establishes the rights, but then there's also obligations on institutions, states, duty bearers, and frontline workers to ensure that we safeguard the principles. And those include safety and protection. We prevent further harm by showing up and in a manner that is dignified for our clients and ensures justice, accountability, and remedy. We amplify the voices and respect the choices of the survivors. A survivor is always at the center of the approach and the way forward in terms of how their matters are handled, and not just within the system, but within our advocacy and messaging. And we should always respect confidentiality, and disclosures must stay safe, because gender-based violence is not just a human rights violation or a criminal offense, but that speaks to the dignity of a person. It speaks to the esteem, the self-esteem of a person, the psychosocial well-being of a person, mental health issues. So it's a very multi-dimensional. Hence, it's very important for us to have the principles in place and always respect them as frontline workers and everybody broadly. And we should also always ensure trauma-informed care. We do no further harm, and we ensure that we provide inclusive and accessible services to everyone. We can move on to the next slide, Anka. But now the question comes as who needs protection? It's important to know that rights are universal, but barriers to accessing those rights are not. We are from a country that has, and in the world that has been based on patriarchal standard, where women have been subjected to, women and children subjected to violence, cycles of violence, some rooted on harmful gender understanding, patriarchal norms, and etc. So women are a vulnerable group that, gender-based violence affects the most. And this is, our response should also always ensure that we ensure equality and non-discrimination, bodily integrity and safety, freedom from all forms of violence, access to justice and remedies, access to health, care, and recovery. And in terms of how we respond for our children is we ought to ensure that protection from abuse and exploitation is in the best interest of the children, and they have a right to be heard, and we ought to offer child-friendly justice and support. And these are some of the most vulnerable groups. These have been recognized through our policy framework, national action plans. Persons with disabilities, older persons, LGBTQIA+ community, migrant and vulnerable, migrant and refugees, rural and home and low income survivors. And the rural and low-income survivors have been particularly added there and are a vulnerable group, because remember, one of the speakers might have mentioned that there's an extra level of a barrier to accessing justice for survivors, which is dependency, financial dependency, as one of the barriers that exist. You can move on to the next slide, please. And we now get to a real access to justice. I want to know that justice is a journey, not a single moment. So we need to dismantle beliefs that justice is a one-stop show. It is a consolidated, a comprehensive journey that a GBV survivor walks in, and we ought to ensure that they can report safely, they get immediate protection, there's respectful responses, and thorough and proper efficient investigation, and we deliver care and recovery. So the question really for us as frontline workers and everybody else countrywide is not a question of was a case opened, but a question of could the survivor exercise their rights safely. Please move to the next slide. And how do we then build survivor-centered system? A change is really needed across the whole system, not one service, not just the criminal justice system, but across board. We do that. We implement change or invoke change by implementing the NSP and the pillars that we portrayed in the very first context-based slide. We close the gap between law and practice. There is quite a lot of disconnection between what the law promises people and inhabitants of the Republic of South Africa and the practice thereof. One would ask, but if I have a freedom of security and autonomy as a person, as a right, then why am I a victim of violence? That is the gap that we close in terms of the law and policy. Policy must be fit for purpose. And we ought to reform justice as one of the pillars. As we need to do better investigations and evidence collection. We all know that, in terms of gender-based violence related matters, one of which is rape, we have a backlog in terms of DNA collection and all sorts of systematic delays. But we need to do consistently advance investigation processes and evidence collection and keep survivors informed. And the other aspect or component of building a survivor-centered system is coordination and oversight. This is coordination between multi-sectoral government departments, NGOs, and avoiding working in silos in the implementation and realization of gender-based violence survivors' rights. And we ought to ensure that our independent monitoring services are fit for purpose and are efficient to tackle the issues and the root causes of GBV. And the last one is prevention and youth. We ought to tackle the root causes of gender-based violence. And NACOSA does that through the My Journey program, which we provide legal literacy, sensitization of government departments or any duty bearer in the access to justice and integration of human rights. And we also do that through community dialogues, because for us to be able to ensure that our services are fit for purpose, we need to then go into into uprooting the root causes of GBV. And I think that is my second last slide. Please move to the last one. And a key takeaways is that we must listen, protect the voice, the choice, and confidentiality, align, which is connect the law, policy, and frontline practice, and then we act, coordinate prevention, protection, justice, and recovery. And I want to close it by saying, particularly on the previous slide in number 4, if you can go back to that slide, which says we tackle the root causes of GBV. I want to close it by saying we can never successfully mop the floor if the tap is still open. So thank you very much. That is my cue.
Thank you so much, Vuyokazi, and such a powerful presentation that you've given us. As you were speaking, I was making notes, and the two things that I noted on my side was rights are universal, but barriers are not. And justice is a journey, not a single moment. And in caps next to it, I wrote powerful. because that's how it felt when you were talking about it and speaking to that. So I just want to appreciate again your presentation and what you've spoken about today. And I really also appreciated that you said that gender-based violence is fundamentally a human rights issue. It's not just a criminal justice issue, because I think we almost, go to that in society. We think, okay, it's just a criminal justice thing. It's just another process that's being followed, and we forget about the human rights that are at the core. You also spoke about meaningful responses requiring more than laws alone. You said you require systems and services that uphold dignity, autonomy, equality, and justice for every survivor. So that really stood out to me. And I also just want to say, from your presentation and also from Sharon's presentation, you both mentioned gender-based violence and femicide being declared a national disaster. And I think that's really something that we should also talk about when we come into our facilitated discussion a bit later, because what does that actually mean in South Africa in this day and age? So our final speaker will help us to understand what this all looks like in day-to-day practice. Palesa Maseko is a dedicated social worker with over 8 years of experience in gender-based violence response, child protection, psychosocial support, and community development. She currently works at A Re Ageng Social Services, where she provides trauma-informed care to survivors of domestic violence and their children through case management, counseling, advocacy, and multidisciplinary collaboration. Holding an honors degree in social work, Palesa is passionate about empowering vulnerable individuals and strengthening families through evidence-based interventions. Her expertise includes individual and group counseling, behavioral change programs, family reunification, stakeholder engagement, and developing sustainable support plans. She is committed to promoting social justice, protecting human rights, and creating safer, more resilient communities through compassionate and professional social work practice. Palesa will speak on the critical role of shelters in GBV response. Palesa, thank you for joining, and over to you.
Thank you so much for sharing the screen. So just around the critical role of shelters, and A Re Ageng is just one example of many, I'm sure. They obviously provide immediate safety and protection. That's what the clients need. There's emergency accommodation and very basic needs. They do crisis intervention, emotional support, trauma recovery and healing. And they have this pathway to independence. So as this presentation unfolds, you'll see some more examples of this. Next slide. So in terms of the admission process, I think this is a standard admission process at facilities. They will do a referral from stakeholders. So within the West Rand area, A Re Ageng's head office is based just behind the police station. So they get court referrals, they get SAPS referrals, and a few other places that refers to them. So then they will have this intake. They've got 2 shelters in 2 areas, and then they've got a victim empowerment facility. They also have staff placed at the victim friendly rooms. They've got a diversion program. So they're doing so much in the space, but then they'll get these referrals in. Then they will have a comprehensive assessment. They'll do then a risk assessment with their safety planning. So Palesa is the social worker, and then she's got a team with her. Then they'll do an individual development plan, and then they'll offer the support and the necessities. To add that they do these services not only for the female, for the women, but they also take their children in as well. So any of the school-going children and younger is welcome to be housed with the mother in the facility. Next slide. Some of their comprehensive services they offer at the shelter, so they're really holistic in the services they offer. So definitely they offer counseling and psychosocial support. They offer case management. Like I said, they've got social workers, SAWs. In fact, their full complement of staff with many volunteers is 80 staff or 83. They offer parenting programs. They offer legal and medical referrals, documentation for grant and assistance, and then the therapeutic group program. So an example of the parenting support, I said they've got the children that lives in the shelter with the parents. And so they've got family rooms as well as single rooms. And then they enroll these learners into the schools, the local primary school or secondary school. Um, And let's say a child is supposed to, let's say the 6 months is done in October or September, then they allow the mother and the children to stay till the school year is done before they are exited from the service. So in that way, they offer parenting support to the parent and the learners as well. In terms of their medical services, they've got a local health the facility right there closest to the shelter. So the parents and the learners can go there and they'll jump the queue. They'll get preferential treatment when they get to the facility. Next slide. And so let's just expand on this. So the children will enter the shelter, and how they feel is that children are really victims. They're in the invisible victims in domestic abuse because some of them have witnessed abuse, some of them are abused themselves or neglected, but many children coming with their parents are witnesses to the spousal abuse. So this is why they're often invisible victims. The responsibility of the team at A Re Ageng is to ensure that they are safe while also supporting the emotional and developmental needs. Like I say, they get enrolled into the local school and then they get supported so that they don't miss out on any schooling in that 6 months. And then children also receive therapeutic support. They've got play activities, and then they help children heal, obviously, from the trauma of the abuse to prevent onward violence. Next slide. So in terms of case management, this is the foundation of the services offered. Like I said earlier on, they'll get an IDP, they'll do goal setting, monitoring, multidisciplinary collaboration, they'll have strengths-based interventions, and then there's reintegration planning. And they'll talk a little bit about this further on in the presentation. Next slide. So in terms of the psychosocial support, they receive, obviously, experiencing abuse affects every aspect of the person's life. So they struggle with anxiety, depression, and a whole host of other things. The psychosocial support interventions includes individual counseling, group counseling, trauma-informed care or support, parenting support, mental health referrals, and then building resilience and confidence. Next slide. So I wanted to speak about this one because we've seen this firsthand. So with our program with A Re Ageng, NACOSA was supposed to support A Re Ageng with 20 young ladies in the shelter, which we then took on a journey of training them, mentoring, financial literacy skills, and then tracking them. We also referred them to NYDA. So this is one example of the work that they do as an organization. They build independence through communication skills, decision making, conflict resolution, financial literacy, skills development training, employment readiness, and then entrepreneurship. So they teach, they've got they're in the process of sorting out a bakery, but they've got baking classes in their facility. They've got a local hairdresser that they partner with. So they've got hairdressing skills, they've got this nails and beauty things, and then they also do yeah. So then women who are based at the shelter while the learners are at school, while the children is at school, the ladies then go through these courses themselves. And A Re Ageng has partnered with a few people in the area. They've also amazingly partnered with one of the mines. And then they've also partnered with a local law firm. So as they need services offered, they will then get services like lots of things happen there for Mandela Day, but lots of the services are also linked to this empowerment programs of their beneficiaries. Next slide. Just around the reintegration, the ultimate goal of the shelter services is not permanent accommodation because we know that it's a 6-month program, which can be extended by a month or two based on the individual circumstances. Before exiting the shelter, clients are assessed to secure housing if that's possible, employment opportunities or skills. They get their social grants application and then they receive ongoing counseling by the social workers. Where appropriate family reunification or reintegration is made possible. This is if it's safe for the client and the children. And then aftercare continues, even if the shelter, even with the shelter, even with the person having exited. I mean, there was one example in this year where they even supported the person came in as an emergency placement with the family, with the children, and then she was discharged thereafter, and then there was an event and the lady passed away, and A Re Ageng even supported to host to supported with the funeral of that lady, because I think the approach is once somebody's in the facility, they're part of them and they care for them and so on. So yeah, constant support even afterwards to reintegrate. Next slide, thanks. So one of the success stories, so I'll just read this one. Sorry about that. One of our proudest achievements is supporting women to obtain their driver's license. So they got, remember I said to you guys, they got a mining house to support them. And so the mine paid for 10 ladies to go through their learners and driver's license programs, and they are willing to pay continuously. They also, one of the staff, they also took them through a social auxiliary worker training, and then this person is now qualified as a social auxiliary worker as well. So they've really invested in stakeholders around the facility. Um, Today, some of our former residents are working as taxi drivers, Uber drivers, scholar support drivers through this program that they have offered. So that's been amazing for them. Next slide. I've got a second success story. They also have this one. We've also assisted many clients with their IDs and birth certificates, successful SASSA applications, children recovery and school reintegration, safe housing transition. These achievements demonstrates that shelters are not only places of safety, but also centers of transformation. By providing comprehensive support, practical skills, and opportunities, we empower survivors to rebuild their lives, dignity, independence, and hope. Next slide, thanks. I hope I'm doing justice to A Re Ageng. They're just an amazing organization, though. So some of the challenges, the systemic barriers, obviously, is unemployment and poverty, rising costs of living, limited housing availability, delays in housing allocation, criminal justice delays, weak confidence in the justice process, risks despite protection orders, safety concerns for survivors, increasingly complex client needs, limited resources, and staffing pressures. So I think, Sharon, you mentioned earlier on about you can't employ your staff in August if you didn't get the funding yet. And so that's been some of the challenges. Sometimes the funding only arrives 3 months later, but the services must continue. So then they must manage to find funding somehow to keep those in the shelters going, to keep the staff. And so that's why they have a large volunteer complement as well. But obviously, to keep the lights on, this is some of the real challenges that they experience. Next slide. Around sustainability, obviously, what would sustain effective shelters would be reliable funding. Like I say, they get in-kind support in places which really helps them. They would get food from either the lawyers or the mine. They would get food parcels and stuff like that. So that helps when the DSD funding doesn't come through in time. Strong partnerships, and they've demonstrated this in bucket loads. Good governance, staff wellness and development, community involvement, and then income generating activities. Like I said, they're starting a bakery. They taught some of the ladies who wants to bake how to bake, and they also, with the bakery infrastructure now being built, they also have a partnership with local organizations that will buy the bread from them. And so in this way, they'll generate their own income as well. Next slide. So just some recommendations. Increase sustainable shelter funding. I think everyone can agree with that. Prioritize housing for GBV survivors, expand employment opportunities for the survivors, strengthen economic empowerment, reduce court delays, improve protection order enforcement, expand mental health services, increase specialized support for children, strengthen multi-sector collaboration, and then invest in prevention and long-term recovery services. Next one. All right. In conclusion, shelters are far more than emergency accommodation. I think that was said before. They are places of safety, healing, and empowerment and hope. They protect lives, restore dignity, and provide survivors with an opportunity to rebuild their futures. However, shelters cannot end GBV on their own. I think Vuyokazi mentioned that in hers as well. You can't keep mopping while the tap is open. A meaningful response requires collaboration between government, the justice system, law enforcement, healthcare services. So civil society, private sector, and communities, every stakeholder has a role to play in protecting survivors, holding perpetrators accountable, and addressing the root cause of violence. We must also recognize that true recovery extends beyond leaving an abusive relationship. Survivors need access to safe housing, employment opportunities, quality mental health services, education, and justice. When these systems work together, survivors are empowered. And so that's basically what they're doing at A Re Ageng, trying to break the cycle of violence and restore dignity to the women and boys. And so this is not a stain in their lives, it's just a stepping stone to carry on and do better going forward. I think they've just shared some pictures. Next slide. Yeah, so this is just some of the examples in the program that NACOSA partnered with A Re Ageng. There was different courses that they got uniforms for these young ladies, and they just did amazing work to try and upskill them in their facilities, and they've partnered with local organizations as well. I think that's the last one. Thank you so much. Thank you. Back to you, Anka.
Thank you so much,
I'm not
Colleen. And I do believe that you did them justice. Everybody was clapping, saying transformative and impressive in the chat. So thank you for that. I also just want to check with Palesa because she was able to rejoin. Palesa, are there any points that you want to add to the presentation from what Colleen took over? Okay, I'm not sure if Palesa is able to speak, but thank you so much, Colleen. Much appreciated. And also something that was just flowing through all of the presentations. My key takeaway is that shelters are so much more than simply a place of temporary accommodation. They are centers of transformation, and that came out through all of the presentations that we saw. And also, what stood out about this organization is that services are linked and they are partnering. And this also came out in Sharon's presentation, talking about stakeholder engagement, talking about working with other services within the community. So, such important messaging that we're seeing today. So, with that, I want to thank all of our speakers, and we're now going to move over into a facilitated discussion. So, before we come to any questions on the chat, I haven't seen any questions, but please a reminder to everyone that has joined, you can put your questions in the chat, and we'll also have a session where you can raise your hand and ask questions after this facilitated discussion. So as we were mentioning, and perhaps, Colleen, you can also contribute to this discussion if Palesa is unable to give commentary. But from all the conversations that we've now had, as I said, we saw that gender-based violence and femicide was declared a national disaster. So the question that was coming up is what does this actually mean? And this was actually in last year where it was declared a national disaster, and recognizing the scale of the crisis and committing South Africa to a more coordinated national response. But from where each of you are sitting, what meaningful progress have you seen that from the declaration, and where do you think the biggest implementation gap still remains? And Sharon, I saw that you already touched on it a bit in the chat, so I'm going to ask you first. What is your take on this?
Yeah, thank you very much. You know what? When it was declared a national disaster, everyone was extremely happy. But what does that mean in practice? And at grassroots level, we experience that nothing has changed. So it is what more can we do as the sector to ensure that government departments allocate more funding to shelters. I've also mentioned that, 25% of the operational cost of shelters is what many of the shelters receive from government department. And the fundraising environment isn't great. So it's not easy to fundraise. So I don't know what more. We're going into Women's Month tomorrow, and we're going into 16 days of activism. What more is it that we can do? Thank you.
Thank you so much. And also such an important reflection because we're going into Women's Month. We're going to see a lot of events. We're going to see a lot of
Correct.
talks on this, but what is the change that's actually going to come? Because everybody, steps up when it's that time, almost just from a campaign perspective. And we get that, but what's actually going to happen from it? So very important reflection. Vuyokazi, I want to check with you from your perspective, from the human rights perspective, from what Sharon says, is that also reflecting what you're seeing?
Hi, Anka. I do think that one of the things that stand out for me in terms of every speaker today is that there is still a huge disconnection between the laws and lived realities. Across from Sharon to the last presentation now, which is really at community grassroots level, centered kind of an organization that offers this transformative, impressive work. But then one of the challenges that they spoke to, which I noted down, was delays in criminal justice system. Was delay, was lack of trust in the justice processes. We cannot safely say that the declaration has had any impact if we don't have a coordinated approach in terms of how we deal with those delays in the justice system. How do we then ensure that there's a rebuilding of trust at community level? Survivors are trusting the process. They are trusting the responsiveness of the system. Yes, there's quite a lot of interventions that are being unpacked in terms of transforming the system itself, the justice system itself. But those are just meaningless if they are just symbolic. I like what you mentioned, that there's a lot of campaigning that is going to come into play now, but that's just symbolism if it does not reach a Vuyokazi that is consistently stigmatized for being as a survivor and a victim of gender-based violence. If it does not move me as a Vuyokazi from being a victim to being a survivor, then that is just symbolism. So I think we need to emphasize, especially as we enter into the two very transformative months, being the 16 days of activism, including the Women's Month, we need to actually be amplifying the voices of, let's have an integrated and let's close the breach, let's close the disconnect, and let's make law and justice system be meaningful to people that need it the most.
100%. So essentially what you're saying is that the real challenge remains ensuring that those commitments are consistently experienced by survivors at community level. So yes, we've got it at a policy level, but how does it filter down? How are people on the ground experiencing that? So very important reflections. And I want to come to the second question, and maybe Colleen, I can come to you first when I ask this question. Today's discussion has emphasized survivor-centered care, dignity, non-discrimination. Yet we know that some survivors face additional barriers when seeking support. So when I say additional barriers, I'm talking about people who use drugs. I'm talking about migrants, as Vuyokazi mentioned them, LGBTQIA persons, people with disabilities, and also people experiencing homelessness, because I think we often, almost forget about them when we're having these discussions. So how do we ensure that our shelters and gender-based violence services are truly accessible to everyone who needs them? Colleen, if I can just get some reflections from you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Anka. I think just working with our CBOs on the ground, both in this program and in another program called a Valtera program in the Northwest and in Limpopo, we're finding that shelters are accessible. I'm not sure, like Sharon says, they maybe don't get their day in the sun or something like that. And I'm not sure if people are aware of it, but there are two separate kinds of shelters. There's the homeless shelter, and the challenge is not inaccessibility. The challenge is that there's insufficient shelters. You know, our country just does not have enough shelters for the amount of homeless people comparatively. So I think that's an area, a huge barrier, and that's where we're saying we need all partners to come on board. Um, for our GBV shelters, I think they are also accessible. Obviously, people go via SAPs if they need to, or they'll go via an organization. Many people don't know the process. Some people are still anxious, or they feel like, for example, somebody will go for a protection order and then they withdraw it. You know, so people don't always know the process of how to access these services. And I think that much more education needs to be done on what kind of shelters are available. And like Sharon says, they've had more than 3,000 calls or something like that. So, what kind of shelters will serve which kind of persons, so that all of our people, that barriers removed for all people, our older persons, our LGBTQI, you know, any one of those that was mentioned by Vuyokazi, we definitely need way more education on these services and what they are able to offer. Yeah. Thanks.
100%. Thank you so much for that reflection, Colleen. And Sharon, I see you are commenting on the chat, but you're welcome to also come in now with your perspective on this.
Thank you very much. So what I've just put in the chat is, what Minister Groenewald said, the amount that prisoners get or that is spent on prisoners per day. And when we look at the amount that, is spent, the per bed capacity, or the per bed amount for adult victims, and that doesn't include the children, is something like 50 to 60 rand. And it's definitely completely inadequate for shelters to survive on. Yeah, so more lobbying in terms of funding for shelters is what we need.
Thank you, Sharon. And it came out so strongly in your presentation also when you spoke about sustainability and funding, because we're seeing this a lot within the NGO space. How are you going to sustain yourself beyond the grants that are provided? What are you going to do? But it's also like, what other support can be offered? How do we progress beyond this point where we just, we're talking about funding, but now what else? What else? So that's one of the big things that's always coming out. And we almost need to look internally and figure out what are we going to do. But it would be so useful if we just getting more support and telling us, this is where you need to go. This is how you're going to sustain from this point onwards. So such important reflections. And also for, everybody that's joined today who's also commenting on the chat, you know we really appreciate all the different perspectives and also how you can assist us in figuring out the way forward almost. But also I want to now come to my last question, and I also want to open this up to the participants that have joined today. So many people joining us work in the NGO spaces. We see that on the chat with everybody that's commenting, community organizations and government. So, if there's one practical action that you would encourage organizations to implement tomorrow to strengthen survivor-centered GBV services, what would it be? So, I'm asking firstly to our panelists today and then coming to the participants on the chat. So, the question is, if there was one practical action that you would encourage organizations to implement tomorrow to strengthen survivor-centered GBV services, what would it be? One practical action. Vuyokazi, I want to come to you first.
I was hoping that would be last, but one of the issues that are applied for GBV is that you want to speak out and you can't because the system does not allow you to do so. So what if I were to implement one thing tomorrow, practically so, there is a consolidated multi-organization approach to lobby our government to adopt the same strategy they adopted when they were dealing with the migration issue of having a virtual court. If the issue is that we have backlogs in our courts in terms of ensuring access to justice, what is then the plan now that we have the national disaster? Domestic violence courts alone are not enough. The strategy that the Department of Justice has implemented to say that the first 2 hours of every district criminal court should be to hear family and domestic violence matters is not enough, and it's not standardized across the country in any event. So we need to have those practical, meaningful mechanisms to ensure that people access justice, and that is survivor-centered. The Batopele principles must be brought to light. It mustn't just be a poster that exists in our court corridors, exists in our organization, without actually translating into lived realities for people that enter into the system, particularly the criminal justice system. Thank you, Anke.
Thank you so much, Vuyokazi. Such an important reflection. Sharon, I want to come to you next, and I see you put your camera on immediately, so you're ready to go.
Yeah, thank you very much. One of my other I'm very busy with my volunteer stuff. I am really busy. But I attended a workshop the week on Saturday. And Quentin Adams, I'm sure, I don't know if many people know about him, but he is known as the shack builder. And he was saying, how do we tell people what we are doing? And maybe we're not telling people enough. But it's not, when you do fundraising, to do fundraising for shelters isn't an easy thing. So I want to say to shelters, can we look differently at our fundraising strategy? How are we going to tell donors out there what we are doing so that they can come in and come, to support? The West Rand, where A Re Ageng is based, the mines are there, Limpopo and Mpumalanga. How is it that we can change our fundraising strategy so that we do get funding from business sector out there? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sharon. And I almost feel like we need a session on its own just to talk about fundraising, to talk about funding, to talk about sustainability, and to really unpack. So thank you for that. Colleen, I want to come to you lastly with my question.
Thanks. I wonder if Palesa is also still in the room and if she can speak. Palesa, can you, before I jump in? Okay, so I'm going to speak from the survivor point of view, Anka. I know that you spoke from the law and Sharon from sustainability. I want to say that we need to strengthen referral pathways. I feel like many survivors or many victims, like I said earlier on, people just don't know. People don't know where to go to, how to access services, who do I contact when this happens, what's the phone number, that kind of thing. I know now it's an election year, and you often hear politicians say, for your electricity needs, phone this, for your water needs, phone that, But for our day-to-day clients and their needs, where do they go to? Who do they refer? So I feel like organizations, as a collective, we need to strengthen our referral pathways so that every survivor knows where's a shelter, where can I get support, where can I get counseling, where can I get health care or post-violence care, where do I go for a protection order? Those are the kinds of things, or other justice services. Those are the kinds of things that would support us in the survivor-centered approach and move the needle in that way for survivors. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Colleen. So we're now going to move over to our audience and to check if there's any questions from the audience. I have noted that there's comments in the chat, everybody just tapping into the conversation. I just want to read two of them that I've seen. So one is from Sekese. Far greater effort must be explored in including men because they are the main perpetrators and are also part of the solution. So positively engaging them will then be a step towards closing the tap in preparation to mop. So I like that reflection as well. And then I also see that there's been some new research that's also posted. So I do want to encourage people to come to the chat and see what's being mentioned in the chat. And then I see one last reflection here saying that funding is one major challenge. Staff turnover or retaining staff is a problem as they are leaving for greener pastures and leaving organizations due to low salary scale and no increase for 5 years. Even daily funding for running of the organization is limited and does not suffice, which is very true. Like I said, we can speak all day on funding. And that's the reality when it comes to staff, because can you really hold them back from exploring better opportunities or better paying opportunities? I mean, when we're talking about low income, those people are reflecting here as our vulnerable groups as well. So you also need to respect that people need to explore better opportunities where they can better their lives. But such a great reflection. I did see a hand, so I just want to check. I think the person put their hand down.
My name is Lucky Chifka Mbilini. I'm from A2 organization based in Krugersdorp, West Rand. Am I still audible?
Yes, you are. Please pose your question.
Okay. Yeah, two things, ma'am. I'm presently working with an organization. It is Mohau Homeless Shelter, as I'm just mentoring and assisting them. My worry is that one, I see, or I was listening to the conversation now, and then it seems like even today we still are focusing on the women and children. And then GBV cut across, you find a situation where, example, where I'm mentoring, the organization that I'm mentoring, that is Mohau. It's got a lot of men. We are housing about 53 people in that environment. Part of which most of the people that are there are men. What do we do in case of saying, because like I say, GPV is cutting across. You find a situation that people within the same environment are men, then probably also that they've been going through the so I need to ask to maybe also look at that sometimes when we speak about GBV, we should not only concentrate into women per se, only. But one of the things that I needed to find out from you colleagues is that can you maybe stretch in terms of especially the capacity building, the human right, as one of the panelists did discuss that, we need this type of information. What type of collaboration can we have, or type of partnership that we can have in terms of you maybe come and capacitate us on
Lucky, thank you for the question. We did lose you a bit at the end, but we will ask that you put your details in the chat, so that relevant partners can also reach out to you if there is opportunities to collaborate. Also state in which province you are so that people that are joined would also know how to reach out to you. And I do want to ask Sharon if you can maybe take a go at Lucky's question.
It was very difficult for me to hear Lucky, so if you put it in the chat, and he can say, like you asked, in what province he is, then, we can see, how we can assist. So Lucky, if you can just put in, where you are, and then we'll get back to you. Thank you. I mean, I can get the provincial rep from the shelter movement in the province that Lucky is to assist. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sharon. Vuyokazi, please go ahead.
Oh, I just wanted to say I heard Lucky. He basically has two questions. One is how do we then collaborate on strategic collaborations on human rights and capacitating small organizations, like not small organizations, but organizations based at community level, as he supports Mohau Homeless Shelter. He's in the Krugerstop area in the West Rand. And that's his question number one, which is to collaborate, and how do you do that in terms of capacitating? I think you answered him on that. And also his first questions was really, the conversation is really focusing on women and children. A lot of men in his shelter, in the shelter that he supports, is housing about 53 men, and so is really asking in terms of how do we then ensure that we also speak on gender-based violence as far as it relates to men being the victims. I do want to take just one liner on the response to say, part of the work, especially in the legislative and policy and practices, is really to balance the imbalances of the past. And I think the Constitution speaks to that. The imbalances of the past, particularly as it relates to gender-based violence, are that women have far been marginalized and statistically are the I normally jokingly say in less formal conversations, unlike this one, that we have been a regular customer of the gender-based violence system. Hence, conversation is always centered on women and children. But that doesn't mean that the criminal offenses that are aligned or speak to gender-based violence, or the laws and policies are saying that women are the victims only. There is no gender specificity in terms of the protection per the law. So I think really the overemphasis on women and children, it's because we've been a regular customer. But part of uprooting harmful norms is to also then speak about men being destigmatized in terms of speaking out as well when they are victims of gender-based violence, and uprooting this assumption that GBV, domestic violence, and any other protections legally and otherwise are targeted for women. And I've come across men saying that domestic violence court is a court for women, but that's not true. That is a harmful myth that exists out there. So I think, that's my response to Lucky. I'm sure Cheryl will have a more nuanced one. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Vuyokazi, for reflecting what Lucky was asking, but also speaking to answering his question. And I think it was such an important answer that you gave, because we know that men are also, survivors when it comes to gender-based violence. It's not only women, but as you said, women are, so to say, the biggest customers. I say quote unquote, biggest customers. So thank you so much for that reflection. I just want to say to everyone that has joined, we have run slightly over time. And I just want to check if there's any other questions. Colleagues are allowed to put their hand up for final questions before we come to a closure. Okay, I don't see anybody else raising their hands. So thank you to everyone okay, let me just quickly check the chat. Okay, thank you, Colleen. So thank you to everyone who participated today, both through your questions and your engagements in the chat. I'd also like to extend a sincere thank you to each of our speakers for sharing your experience and your insights with us today. We can speak on this for hours, and that's why we're already running slightly over, because there's so much to unpack. And when Lucky brought in the question about men, I was thinking, oh my goodness, that's another conversation that we need to have. So I definitely think there needs to be more of this, Colleen. I'm looking to you as I say that. There's a lot more that we need to talk about. And there's a lot of other vulnerable groups that should also be considered when we talk about gender-based violence, when we talk about shelters, when we talk about human rights. So it's been such a valuable discussion that has reminded us that addressing gender-based violence requires collaboration. It requires survivor-centered approaches and a continued commitment to human rights. So at this point, it is my pleasure to again hand back to Colleen Wagner, who will offer some closing reflections and officially close today's webinar. So over to you, Colleen.
Thanks, Anke. And just to note that we have, as Anke said, we have gone over. And so there's so much to share, but I'm gonna not do all the closing reflections just because the other meetings have started, but maybe just to express again an appreciation to our speakers, our partners, our donors, our government representatives, our civil society, and every one of you for being part of this meeting, especially to Sharon from the National Shelter Movement, to NACOSA, and then to A Re Ageng. I just put in the chat a call to action. There was a question that Vuyokazi posed to us about how do we break the cycle of violence by advancing human rights? And I've just put 4 points in the chat so that you can look at that. um, Listening to survivors, listen to people, listen, hear their voices, act through timely referrals. I mentioned that earlier on to strengthen our referral pathways. And then partnerships, build these collaborations with organizations like I was giving A Re Ageng as an example, and then empower survivors on their journey to safety and recovery. We're going to have to address the criminal justice system, the human rights piece. We're going to have to do all of that. We're going to have to do more for men, as Anka says. There are so many offshoots and conversations from this, but at least we have made a commitment to start, and we're aiming to turn this around in a human rights survivor centered way. Thank you. This meeting is officially closed. And Anka, a huge thanks to you for moderating. You've done well. We appreciate you. And thank you to Letu for your tech support as well. Thanks all. Meeting is over. Bye bye.